So I'm absolutely thrilled to be introducing our next speaker, John Green. So John is the Vice President of HSE for SNC-Lavalin, based in Montreal and London, and he brings more than 40 years experience in safety to our screen today. So you can imagine the things that John has seen and done in that time. John has worked in the oil, gas, petrochemical, electronics, heavy engineering, construction and aviation sectors, and is a global force for change in how industrial safety is delivered. And in fact, John was voted the most influential person in safety and health in 2017, which is extremely impressive. John has held senior positions with global powerhouses like Motorola, British Airways and Laing O'Rourke, and has worked on some pretty big projects like the London Olympics as well. And in his spare time, I really don't know how he has any at all. He spends it climbing mountains in Europe and scuba diving across the world. And today we get the pleasure of diving into and getting insight into John's world and what John calls his travel log. And it's pretty extensive. John is one of the original architects of doing safety differently. He's an absolute star in this place. So please welcome to your screens, John Green.
Previous incarnations of safety that others might only be able to see through the eyes of research and research papers. So the stuff that you read about on LinkedIn, I've actually lived through and worked through. And I remember my early days as a regulator when my in-tray, and it was an in-tray and not an inbox, my in-tray was full of serious accidents and incident reports and actually very little else. So I can understand the fixation with reducing incident rates at the time. And it's probably because of that experience that I like to think that the current evolution of safety differently, safety 2 or HOP, whatever it is you want to call it, is actually built on the relative success of those earlier programs and not in spite of them, however ill-informed they might appear now in hindsight. Now, I actually feel a little bit like a thorn sandwiched between two academic roses at the moment. and for that reason, this isn't going to be a scholarly 20 minutes. It's going to be more of a travel log. So it will be less Stephen Hawking and more Michael Palin, I suspect. I actually want to kind of romp through my experiences of building different approaches to safety in organizations across the world. And while I don't believe there is a fixed formula or recipe for success, I do believe that there are some elements that are critical to change programs being successful, and there are definitely some lessons to be learned. Firstly, I'm happy to accept that whatever we're doing now will, as with all other programs, expire and cease to add value. I think of our current efforts as a finite game. It's challenging, it's feedback rich, and it's progress driven, which are the three critical elements of game theory. A finite game within an infinite game. And perhaps the first lesson is that we should actually banish all thoughts of ever finding a permanent solution to this eternal problem of organizational safety. And I think if we do that, actually perhaps we can approach the problem with a degree of sanity. I remember this as being a cornerstone of our first discussions in Melbourne, when a small group of us, actually it started off as a pretty large group, but for a variety of reasons, I suspect my sparkling wit and Sydney's engaging style with an audience of 40, there were only 5 of us left after lunch. Myself, Sydney, Daniel Hammerdal, Kelvin Genn, and Michael Tuma were the only ones remaining to discuss how we might operationalise Sydney's work and produce a playbook for organisations. And at the time, we were adamant, in fact, that platform had to be able to evolve. It had to allow for constant curiosity and examination, and it had to maintain the ability for the users to be surprised. Now, I took this idea back to my chief executive officer at the time, Cathal O'Rourke, convinced that a forward-looking organisation like Laing O'Rourke would leap at the chance of breaking down the norms around safety. And he looked at me with a mixture of surprise and pity. And he said, "We knew this time would come, John. You've just spent far too long in the Australian sun, and you've simply lost it." Now, this wasn't the response I was expecting or indeed had hoped for. He was an engineer. The business was full of engineers. They had seen their incident rates tumble from 40 to 4. Their linear minds further improvement was just about more effort. It was about hearts and minds and all the usual stuff. He was convinced that zero was a realistic target and that safety was achieved through the collective compliance of the workforce. Now these were clever people. They understood the impracticality of more rules. They knew that zero wasn't achievable and that all accidents weren't preventable. Yet when they were pushed, they continued to subscribe to this command and control dogma. And it was clear to me during this discussion and every subsequent discussion I've actually had with chief executive officers across the world that the bond I was trying to break between this commitment to zero, this addiction to zero, and their individual commitments was a powerful one. Simply trying to win this argument from a theoretical perspective or a theoretical standpoint wasn't going to cut it. They needed to see it for themselves. Cahill was convinced that safety was achieved by people following the rules. I was convinced that people adapted to create safety and other outputs from work. So we went to see people at work and we visited a project. Now, it's pretty difficult for an O'Rourke to visit a project in southeast Queensland without anyone knowing he's coming, but we tried to disguise the fact that we were going to arrive, and we were undertaking our traditional safety leadership visit where we would walk amongst the troops, hems of garments would be touched, people would be miraculously cured of all ills, and everything would be right with the world. And as usual, we strolled onto this particular project. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. All the documents could have been smudged with your fingers. Tools were shiny, and high visibility clothing was neatly pressed and immaculate. And Cahill pointed to them, and we noticed that they were all working where they should be working. They were working on top of one another. They were working in difficult positions. There were probably more people in one place than there should be, and not enough people in the other place than there should be. And Cahill looked at them and said, "Look, John, look how they struggle to follow the rules, but follow the rules that they do." And I said, "Cahill, do you know why they're struggling?" And he said, "Because they're following the rules." And I said, "Cahill, they're struggling because this is the first time they've ever worked this way. And they're doing it because you're here." Surely not. So we decided we would leave and come back the following day. No one was expecting us to come back the following day. It wasn't a done thing, of course. We had done our safety visit. We had ticked our box. No one was expecting us back the following day, but we came back the following day and everyone was working differently. The manpower had been distributed evenly, the way that they thought was right. There were different tools, some of which had been constructed by the workforce, but which were doing the job remarkably well. And they had largely decided themselves how they were going to go to work. And I said, that's how people work, Cahill. That's how people create success, and that's how we get safety as a byproduct of that success. And actually, he went on to be probably one of the stalwarts of the Safety Differently movement, having had that very personal epiphany. And I think that's really important, that very personal epiphany. And that subsequent Safety Differently approach was rolled out across the business. The focus was then on high-risk activities, learning from normal work, micro-experimentation, and decluttering the management system. This was very much a top-down initiative. Well, weren't all safety initiatives top-down? So when I returned to Europe, we tried a slightly different approach. Given the success that we'd had with micro-experiments on the front line, we opted to go bottom-up. And having received a nod from senior management, we essentially gave projects the green light to try stuff that made sense to them, but fed back the outcomes of these attempts to the leadership team via dashboards and reports. Now, that turns out this was a remarkably low-risk strategy in terms of compliance issues, but it came with a few surprises. The low risk came from the fact that the entire management system was under challenge in small pieces from different projects all of the time. So the entire system was being tested, broken, and remade, but the overall system changed in a controlled manner. The surprise came when, after 12 months of projects challenging established ways of working, one director approached me with the concerns that, and I quote, "Nothing much is happening with this Safety Differently stuff." And I asked him why he thought that. And he calmly replied, because we haven't thought of anything yet. So clearly, bottom up wasn't on its own wasn't the way either. I've also discovered that there's a big difference between working in a company that wants this shift and going to work for one that thinks it does. Making these changes can challenge a lot of relationships, and that's made an awful lot easier if you already have positive relationships and a kind of a line of credit that you can draw against. And that was certainly my position in Laing O'Rourke and other European companies I've worked with. I could challenge existing thinking. It was accepted as a genuine attempt to improve the organization. Whereas in a new company, done the wrong way, it can very easily be seen as change for change's sake. And let me tell you, there are plenty of ways to screw it up. And my first foray into Canada would be one such example. I already knew from my time in the Middle East and the Far East that language and culture can be powerful tools in driving change, and I knew that they could lead to unexpected outcomes. The forerunner to Laing O'Rourke's next gear program was a program called Mission Zero. And we, as all European companies, we rolled this out across the world. So it spread across the world like an epidemic. We took it, we colonized Australia with it. We then colonized the Far East with this idea. And I remember going to our projects in Hong Kong for, I think it was a safety week. And we had Mission Zero banners everywhere in Australia, Mission Zero banners everywhere in the United Kingdom. And we had what I thought was the equivalent banners up in Hong Kong. And I thought this would suit the kind of command and control, the authoritarian style of thinking in Hong Kong rather well. And I asked them what the banners said, and they were very coy about what the banners said in actual fact. And I said, what did the banners say? Because and one of the chaps said to me, well, in Chinese, we don't really have a word that translates easily from zero into anything else. And we didn't always have a number zero. So our numerical system didn't always have a number zero. And so we've just tried to find the nearest thing that fits. I said, well, that's really interesting. What is it? He said, it's impossible. So we had all our sites with banners with Mission Impossible on them. And I can't help but watch Tom Cruise when I when I see him spinning from the buildings in Hong Kong, that perhaps he was inspired by our Mission Zero program at some point. I hope it inspired someone. It didn't particularly inspire any of us. Anyway, in Canada, when I went to work there, we deployed the standard compelling case for change argument, which was built on the approach of, what's our dissatisfaction? What's wrong? What focus we need to take on our program moving forward. This is what we want. How can we get alignment that we all can agree on, and what's the way forward? And finally, execution. This is what the plan is. This was all designed to engage leadership with the execution of the strategy. The problem was it didn't work. It didn't work in Canada anyway. It did with the board, but not with the senior operational teams. It did with the guys on the ground, but not the project leaders. And the same arguments kept coming back, the same statements that others had been making for years before. There isn't a problem here. Well, it's a problem that other people have. We don't have it. Okay, there's a bit of a problem, but we've got it covered and we're managing it quite nicely. And eventually, there's a problem and we need some help. Now, it struck me that I'd heard these arguments before and not in the safety arena. And then I remembered it came from the addictions and cults modules that I'd been studying when I was studying psychology. I was essentially what you were dealing with was the same responses and emotions that you get when you bring an addict off their favorite drug: denial, bargaining, and then acceptance. So why do organizations stick with a program that doesn't work and indeed might be damaging their performance? Could it be that command and control, which lies at the heart of a traditional approach, actually becomes a compulsion? Because if that's the case, then you need a very different approach to convincing people that they need to buy into a program for change. It was clear, however, that the company I was working for at the time in Canada wasn't prepared to accept the philosophical shift required to make these changes sustainable. There was simply too much denial at the level of operational management. And I realized another lesson. learn to say enough is enough. This is not working here, and this is not making sense. Just as culture can be a catalyst and a barrier to change, timing making these changes can be everything. And interestingly, a number of months after I left that organization, they experienced a number of events that caused them to engage a consultant whose plan that was implemented looked remarkably similar to the one that we'd been proposing. And like I say, timing is everything. And we gave this whole getting the timing right thing a name. We called it intelligent waiting, after a special forces tactic of picking the optimum time to strike, even when it meant hiding in the shadows for weeks. Now, I've touched on culture a number of times, and I'm forced to consider that my failure over the years to convince organizations of the compelling need to change hasn't perhaps been the message, but the way in which the message was presented and when various initiatives were launched. Different cultures communicate, debate, and are persuaded in different ways. Forget that, and the best argument in the world will fall flat in its face. For instance, communicating the compelling case for change in Australia is precise, simple, and to the point. There isn't really any need to go into great detail. These points tend to be taken at face value. In Brazil, however, or other parts of South America, that won't work. Messages are multi-layered, they're nuanced, and communications are often between the lines, implied or not clearly expressed. In Australia, the compelling case for change begins with the issue, a fact, and the matter is discussed in a practical, concise manner. Business discussions generally don't touch on theoretical or philosophical matters, where in South America, we'd normally begin with building the theory before drawing the conclusions. And all of this is made even more complicated in Far Eastern countries where there's a bias for a holistic way of thinking. The point is that language and style are important, and don't forget that. To illustrate my point, I want to go back actually over 30 years, and I so wish I truly understood the importance of this event when it happened. Now, I warn you, this story contains strong English industrial language. So if you're offended by strong workforce language, then tune out now. So let me take you back to the 1990s. I was working for an organisation called Lubrizol in the northwest of England, in Liverpool, a working class background. An American-owned organisation who were embarking upon this attempt to get feedback from the workforce on how work was really done and congratulate them when they had found a safer or a better or more efficient way of doing work. And the system was called PRAISE, Positive Reinforcement and Individual Safety Entitlement, a terrible acronym, but fundamentally underneath, what they were trying to do was reasonable. But these two American auditors, these two Texans came across to our plant in Bromborough and wanted to see particularly nasty or difficult operations so they could just check how it was being done against the risk assessments. Now, the nastiest thing we did was something called a fury wash. And so we made additives for fuels and oils. And this particular waxy compound, when it was heated, became like liquid and it was blended in to the fuel stream. But when it cooled, it set like a wax. And the worst job in the plant was cleaning out the wax tanks. So we put two guys in breathing apparatus and big suits into these tanks with steam lances, and they would spend a couple of hours blasting all of this stuff off the insides of the tanks. It would drain down the sluices. It would get all over their protective suits. It would clog the air lines. So really, you just wanted to get in, do the job, and get back out again. And we watched this from the top of the tank in the open manhole, and there was wax spraying out from all over the place, and there was steam leaving. And the Americans said, get them out. We want to have a word with them. We want to tell them what a great job they're doing. We sort of looked and said, really? Is this what you do? Yeah, get them out, get them out. So we tugged on the hoses, which was a way to get the guys out. And they clambered up this wire ladder, this chain link ladder, came out, and you could see the wax starting to set on their protective clothing. And they thought they were in trouble because that's normally the only reason you bring them out of the tank is because they're in trouble. They weren't expected to get, expecting to get congratulations. They took their helmets off. And the two Americans looked at these two scouts, these Liverpool lads, and said, "We just want to say what an excellent job we think you're doing." And the two Scouts lads looked at them and said, "Fuck off." And I thought that just captured perfectly the idea that you can have a brilliant idea, and if you get the timing so wrong, it can just fall flat in its face. And we never saw hide nor hair of those guys again. So perhaps it wasn't Melbourne in 2013 when it all started for me. Perhaps it was Liverpool in 1991 when I actually pressed Ready Player One and asked, "What time is it? And where am I?" And with that, Kim, back to you.
Thank you so much, John. That was highly entertaining, brutally honest, and very, very thought-provoking, that story at the end there. Absolute gold. Thank you so much, John. So for me, a couple of takeaways, John, for me was to really ensure that I have positive relationships and a good line of credit before challenging traditional paradigms. And I think your story there from one of your more recent roles is really insightful for us inside organisations, just to make sure we get that right and we practice that intelligent weighting that you spoke about there. And for those of us who are working in global organisations or in global roles, really the imperative need to consider the cultural context as well. And I think your stories are a fantastic illustration of that. And certainly I don't think anyone in the audience will be forgetting those. So John, thank you so much for your time and your energy and your passion that you give to the industry. For me personally, it's been extremely helpful to put into practice these ideas over the last couple of years. Sydney, I know you've worked with John for many years. What are your thoughts on John's presentation?
It's the great. So I need to be unmuted by someone. Thank you. Am I unmuted? Fantastic. Thank you, John. I love you. That was beautiful. It's wonderful to know that it's turtles all the way, that we're all standing on other turtles, and it goes back to 91, which probably goes back even further beyond that. It just reminds us that the path dependency of the individual stories that we bring to the table today, the coalescence of these experiences together, these experiences that go back all of these years. Around 91, I was in a car with Uncle Jim Reason, right, who had just made his wooden model of the Swiss cheese, right, and tunk, showing it to students at Leiden University, right, so of the accident trajectory going through the holes or not through the holes. And so yet another story that contributed to our thinking about organizational disaster at the time. Some of these set us up for path dependencies that are not very useful. Others certainly resonate even today in many positive ways. I value the personal angle that you brought to this, John, in your stories, and I will remember many of them going forward. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, John. John, we look forward to hearing you on the panel later on today.